So we're here to talk about autistic masking, autistic burnout, and the relationship of those things with school-induced anxiety, or school-induced trauma, as I prefer to call it. A bit of a content warning before we go any further. So this is particularly for the professionals out there. Some of the information that you hear today may be challenging. It may directly oppose information that you might have received in the past, and hopefully reframe the concept of autism for you and reframe some of the things that maybe you've learned in the past. And it may make you sit a little bit uncomfortably professionally, but that's a good thing, because when we're sitting uncomfortably, then we're learning, and when we're comfortable, we tend not to be learning. So it's a really, really good thing to be challenged and not live in our echo chambers. You'll also hear some difficult anecdotal experiences, discussion and statistics about mental health, depression and suicide. And once you recognize these narratives, it can be difficult to unsee them. So I'm always Carrie has my email address. So if people want to talk, or if in the Q&A you want to ask specific questions about specific things, because you might have had some realizations about yourselves, your children, your professional practice, then it's absolutely fine to kind of to ask those questions. The Q&A that we have in the end is a completely non-judgmental arena. I like to be challenged, so if you have challenging questions for me, that's absolutely fine. It's my hope that everything that I say over the next hour and a half or so is going to give you some food for thought for a better understanding of the narratives around autistic people, and perhaps a reframed look at yourselves as autistic people, if there are autistic people here, and hopefully some new tools for everyone to kind of use and explore. So very briefly, a bit about me so that you know who I am. I was diagnosed as autistic in 2003, and I have a background in SEND education and also service provision for autistic adults. So from a professional perspective, I've seen it at both kind of age groups. I'm an international public speaker and writer who provides my own specialist and intensive online trainings aimed at reframing the understanding of autism, alongside shorter trainings such as this on topics such as masking, burnout, monotropism, communication, and autistic culture as well. I provide private consultancy to different organisations all over the world. I'm published academically, and I'm currently co-producing research into interpersonal victimization, autistic masking, autistic identity, and monotropism as well. I'm an honorary research associate at Sunderland University, and I'm a research associate of Grand at University College London as well. I've guest lectured at universities across the UK and regularly guest lecture at the Anna Freud Centre as well. And I'm also a parent. I've got 3 children who are all neurodivergent, 2 of whom have an autism diagnosis, and anything else you want to know about me or any of my work or my blog, you can find at theautisticadvocate.com, which is the address at the bottom. And that's the last you'll hear about me, because I'm completely unimportant to this whole thing. It's the information that we need. The learning objectives for today are to understand the autism narrative from an autistic perspective, to help you define the mask and autistic burnout and identify why they sit at the heart of the autism narrative, and also the relationship that those things have with school-aged children as well and school. Looking at the development and implications of masking and burnout and the role of stigma, othering and marginalisation in their existence. Looking at where the current research and popular narratives around both autism, masking and burnout are misconceptualising things, and recognising the importance of identity and validating autistic experience. Before we go any further, I'd like you to see this tweet by Spectrum, who are one of the biggest autism research magazines in the world. It's like the point of information that people go to for autism research if you are a researcher or a professional working in the field of autism. They stated, autistic people are 4 times more likely to experience depression over the course of their lives than their neurotypical peers. Yet researchers know little about why or how best to help. What I'd like you to do is try to bear in mind this statement that's been made here all the way through my talk, and then we're going to come back at the end and readdress it and see what you think about that statement. Before we can understand masking, we need to establish why the need to mask exists and the context within which it exists. So we need to understand that it's not just a mechanism, but it's actually a reaction. Before I've even entered the classroom, I have to face the cloakroom, a cacophony of screams and shouts, stomping and elbowing, pushing and pulling and shoving, battered and bruised from the multitude of touching before I've even managed to get my coat off. Trying hard to hang a heavy bag on a hook that's full with a coat and PE kit. School uniform making me itch and writhe from the sheer uncomfortableness of it. Exhausted already from the sensory overload, and the day hasn't even started yet. I stay at my peg and allow the children to leap and jump and run and bounce out of the cloakroom, the noise gradually fading as the door eventually stutters shut. They're big, heavy doors, and when they shut, all the noise is cut off. I relish the silence of the room. I stay there, burying my face into the woolen lining of my coat, and I shut my eyes, savouring the soft texture on my face, the warmth, the silence outside my head. My ears are still ringing inside though. My hands root around inside my coat until eventually they find the care label. I rub it between my forefinger, middle finger and thumb, slowly, firmly, repetitively. The pleasure moves from my fingers up my arm. A light glow travels around the exterior of my body. I'm stimming, self-soothing. I just don't have the language for that yet. The door opens and I'm called. I stop stimming. The mask comes clashing down. I'm 7 years old and the day hasn't even begun yet. Autism was first officially recognised in the 1940s. Hans Asperger and Leo Kanner, with a helping hand from the medical profession and the charity industry, are the founders and writers of the narrative that we currently live under. Its roots lie in and remain tied with eugenics, Nazism, and Victorian psychology. Using the framework built by these two men, we've gone on to have a complete misunderstanding and misrepresentation of what autism is, and possibly more importantly, what autism isn't. It's created a worldwide yearly $7 billion autism industry involving charities, universities, pharmaceutical companies, researchers, therapists and behaviourists. And barely a penny of that money ever reaches the pockets of those who need it, autistic people and their families. This framework has fed into a medical and behavioural model of autism, a model which is implicitly biased towards a so-called male presentation of autism, solely because these 1940s experts and those that followed were biased towards boys. A model upon which research papers are based on the supposed wisdom of all these men. Then research papers are created based upon those research papers. Then research papers are created based upon those research papers. And ergo, over the years, myth has become fact. Every few years, the writers of this narrative get together and create a diagnostic criteria, which at its heart is crammed full of bias, flaw, and error. And it's mostly the opinions of a bunch of white, male professionals who egotistically cling onto their theories and beliefs and play politics with those. Proof of this lies in the fact that in 1925, 13 years before Hans Asperger ever spoke publicly for the first time, a Ukrainian researcher called Grunya Sakhareva identified a list of what later came to be known as autism. If you hold that list up to the current diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5, it's almost identical. Only in the world of autism can you make 86 years of supposed progress only to end up nearly a century in the past. Around this, society has developed ways of acting, thinking and doing things based on evolving concepts rooted in historical behaviours. We call these social norms. Alongside this also, society has developed these concepts of what normality is supposed to look like, how people should behave and act. And what has this collectively given the world? Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is literally the process of deciding upon something and using information to reinforce that decision. When we receive information that doesn't align with our preconceived notions, we often exclude it or vehemently reject it. In terms of autism, confirmation bias is informed by the societal and behavioural concepts of autism, many of which are grounded in myths, media stereotypes, textbooks written by non-autistic people who make external observations, and research based on all those notions. We've been spoon-fed a narrative for so long that we've created an image in our minds. We have an idealized image of what autism looks like, and we see what we expect to see. We expect to see autism present only in white boys or men that have learning disabilities or are seen as genius in some way, or whom behave in a particular way. And all because society has been primed to see it that way. So we end up with extreme, narrow views of how autistic people should present. We have the traditional boy-child version of autism, who screams and melts down and makes parents, particularly mothers, lives a misery. Or we have the party trick white male autistic, exceptionally talented, even savant level talented at one thing, but otherwise ridiculously, even comically socially inept, quirky or learning disabled, in many ways deemed as incompetent and Peter Pan-like. These concepts circle back into professional thinking. Diagnosticians fall for the same myths and stereotypes and use those to reject diagnoses. Researchers, despite being huge on avoiding bias, base their research on other research that reinforces this thinking. Ergo, their work is often flawed from the very start. Professionals are too often stuck in textbook mode. If you don't act the way you're expected to act, then you don't get identified, diagnosed, or supported. Very few people have the context needed to be able to step back and see the bigger picture. So they rely on their confirmation bias. They see and hear what they want to based on what they think they know. And all of this plays into autistic masking. A little quiz for you to ponder while I talk through this next section. Which of these two images is from the bedroom of an autistic child? Masking sits at the heart of our understanding of autism. It intersects with disability, ethnicity, education, the workplace, society, but none more prevalent at the moment than gender, with the current narrative of gender in autism. Excuse me, my slides have just disappeared. Can everyone still see my slides? Because they've just vanished off my screen.
Yeah, they're still on,
Yes.
on the screen, Kieran.
They are. That's not helpful. Ah, there it is. Right. So masking sits at the heart of our understanding of autism. It intersects with disability, ethnicity, education, the workplace, society, but none more prevalent at the moment than gender, with this current narrative that we have of gendering autism. Because now, after eradicating former diagnoses used to divide us up into categories of usefulness and productiveness, we now have another subset to contend with, what's being described as the female autism phenotype. A narrative which states autistic women are somehow differently autistic and whom present differently. Of course, autistic women, young and old, have different experiences to autistic men, young and old, in the same way that autistic people of colour, gay autistic people, and so on have different experiences, and in the same way non-autistic women have different experiences to non-autistic men, and so on. Of course, there are different presentations of autism, millions of them, because autistic people are individual human beings. Like with all humans, how a person presents is influenced by the nature of each person, their gender, their personality, their upbringing, their race, their religion, their co-occurring conditions too, and the different impact of those different things on different people. Our identities are shaped by those things, but at the heart of it, as a major driver of those identities, our internal experience of what it means to be autistic, how our brains and bodies function, are incredibly similar and relatable. And regardless of the differences I just mentioned, our life stories are usually remarkably similar too. None of this means that different autistic people experience different things because they're differently autistic. It just means there are autistic people experiencing different things in the same way that all people do. Looking through the eyes of the diagnostic criteria and the current autism narrative, we have the stereotyped typical presentation of autism, which the criteria attempts to describe and which leans to favour white boys who present in that particular way, because that's all who historically was ever looked at. We still view autism through a very limited 1940s lens. But we have those, many of whom don't really fit that criteria, that stereotype, the atypical type, which the current narrative is now telling us explains autistic girls. But neither of these binary narratives is right, as boys can and do regularly present as atypically autistic, and girls can present typically. And equally, we've forgotten that there are transgender boys and girls, non-binary people, and also intersex people who can present in either way too. We present differently because of our intersections of co-occurring conditions, our intersections of identities, our intersections of different socialization and upbringings. We present differently because we're human. Do all non-autistic people present the same way? Do we say non-autistic women have different neurology to non-autistic men? No. Why? Because there's zero evidence of gender brains. But there is plenty of evidence of sexist narratives and limited thinking seen only through a white male historical privileged gaze. Much of this goes completely unseen because of that gaze. The lenses professionals and society look through based on that 100-year-old narrative and other social and cultural factors. When we're unaware of these narratives, it's easier for us to fall into our confirmation bias. It's easier for us to pathologize and create beliefs based on those biases than it is to know to look for reasons why those biases might be wrong in the first place. Society plays a huge part, particularly with those assigned female at birth. Girls and women are seen through a particular societal lens and are generally socialized developmentally on that basis, with expectations of certain behaviors. When an autistic person plays into those expectations, they are more likely to be missed. Does the autistic person choose to play into them? No. It's not the autistic person at fault, but the expectation and bias of those viewing the autistic person based on a narrative of inherent and institutionalized sexism that for a very long time has defined what a woman is supposed to look like and how they're supposed to act. And the same with men. Often an autistic person isn't masking in a way which makes them less obviously autistic. No autistic person can mask in a way that makes them 100% invisible as an autistic person. It's a lack of knowledge and belief in false biases from the observer that makes that autistic person go unseen. We've conjured up words like quirky, geeky, nerdy, bookish, shy, highly sensitive, introvert and extrovert as a way of categorizing people who don't fall neatly into other constructed categories. Yet for autistic women and girls, the fact that they have and still go unseen is now being blamed on the female autism phenotype, on a false belief that autistic women and girls are better at masking, that they've been hiding all this time. That for 100 years, all these researchers and professionals have been hunting furiously for them, scratching their heads as to where they could be. And there they were, right in front of them all along, just using their sneaky autism to hide themselves away. This is a victim blaming narrative that parents and educationalists all over are actually regurgitating, when in actual fact, the researchers and professionals weren't looking for them at all because of their inherited confirmation bias. A colleague of mine, Eleanor Broadbent, describes it like this. When boys line up cars or toys or nuts and bolts in a perfect logical order, it's called autism. When girls line up shoes or dolls or stuffed toys in a perfect logical order, it's called good housekeeping. Exactly the same presentation, but different social expectations. So the idea behind the female autism phenotype is that all autistic women present differently to men because their autistic neurology is different autistic neurology, and that women and girls have been missed because they're vastly superior maskers. Of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with flawed understandings, flawed research, flawed narratives, and a boatload of sexism from a male-dominated narrative. Autistic women and girls need huge focus, but not at the risk of replacing one myth with another myth and then blaming them for it, one that carves us up into constructed groups and causes further damage. Because autistic women and girls don't experience different autism, they experience different layers of prejudice. Going back to the picture in front of you, if you haven't figured it out already, they're both the bedrooms of autistic children. The pink one with the cats belongs to a boy. The one with the cars belongs to a non-binary child assigned female at birth. Just to keep your confirmation bias in check. The view of autistic people is never this, what you can see in front of you. All sorts of people from all walks of life. This is why the mask exists. We aren't safe, we're voiceless, and we go unseen. And it's because of all these narratives, alongside outdated, dehumanizing, stigmatizing theories that have long been deconstructed, debunked, and reframed, but still perpetuate in everyday professional narratives and are still used to inform professionals working with autistic children and adults. Theories that once made up what was called the triad of impairments, for example, like weak central coherence, executive dysfunction, and Simon Baron-Cohen's ideas around theory of mind. His concept that autistic people are unable to empathize with others, that we cannot put ourselves in someone else's shoes. His supposition was based on the results of a research paper and test that has never once been recreated and has been disproven an enormous number of times. In fact, there is a growing weight of research now that non-autistic people struggle to empathize with autistic people. Damien Milton's theory of double empathy and other social theories leading to that. Not to labour the point, but Baron Cohen's concept of autistic theory of mind was conceptualised over 30 years ago. The academic understanding of autism has changed dramatically in the last 5 years and exponentially in the last 2 years and continues to do so. Why have things changed? Because of the work of autistic advocates and autistic researchers who have fought to make the world of academia start to co-produce research with autistic people as equal partners, identifying autistic priorities over non-autistic priorities. If you include the community you seek to learn about, you tend to find out more about them than you do if you just observe and make educated guesses based on previous guesses and with an enormously skewed bias lens. We're starting to see the results of that with a huge number of concepts and understanding of autistic people, things that reframe our understanding of empathy, autistic communication, the way autistic people sit and move, the way we need to learn and process, the way we experience emotions and sensory information, our innate social abilities and our innate culture, all in ways that many of you, even listening to this now, are unlikely to ever even have heard of. Alongside the recognition of how much trauma autistic people are subject to by the society around us that calls itself inclusive and tolerant. There's an incredibly long way to go. It should be unacceptable now for white people to research, make judgments about, and create training about black people, or for men to research, make judgments about, and deliver training about women. The same with straight people researching, making judgments about, and delivering training about queer people. Yet when it comes to autistic people, the narrative is dominated by non-autistic people doing exactly those things. Why are these ancient concepts still relevant? Because things like Baron Cohen's theory of mind is still regularly taught in autism training as though it's fact. So many outdated and disproven concepts are taught in training that calls itself autism training, yet dishes out stereotypes, tropes, and neuronormative focused strategies based on myths and misconceptions, which clearly means it isn't actually autism training at all. Research and academia does not exist in a vacuum, as much as it would like to think that it does. What goes into research papers enters the world. Ideas and concepts and theories become truths. Even when those researchers have moved on to new projects, new ideas, it's the lab rats that pay the price for the mistakes that are made. The misinformation created academia leaks out into society, and as I said before, repeated often enough, sieved through media and cultural filters, enough myth then becomes fact. Those myths inform professional narratives and ideology, and instead of alleviating the barriers faced by autistic people, new barriers are created or existing ones are compounded. The ideology perpetuates that there should be one type of person in the world, the gold standard person, and that person can only conform to the social and behavioural standards that are set for them. Those who do not meet that standard are flawed, deficitized, disordered in some way, and need to be pushed as close to the gold standard as they can be made to be. Things are changing, with co-production becoming more prevalent, but we still have a model based on 100 years of non-autistic people making assumptions about and making decisions about autistic people using nothing more than neuronormative ideas about behaviour. of research reinforcing the supposed fact that autistic people are fixable or should be fixed. It all comes out of this notion that there is a right way to be, and that the right way to be is neurotypical. We're really at a crossroads in all of this, where academia needs to make some hard decisions because we have conflicts in research, as evidenced here. So what you can see in front of you are actually the one on the top left is a screenshot of a study being done at Newcastle University, which is using the drug arbaclofen to increase the social function and ability of autistic children. This is heavy medication with heavy side effects, and they think that by drugging autistic children they can make them more socially acceptable. And this is happening at Newcastle University, which is a long way from you, but isn't very far from me. Underneath that is a study that is an article that I wrote with Dr. Amy Pearson from Sunderland University, a conceptual analysis of autistic masking, which looks to recognize the involvement of stigma and trauma in the existence of autistic people, how much of that impacts on the way that we are. Underneath that is just a study that's looking at social interaction in autistics. So basically what this is, that there was a study at Edinburgh University which looked at social interactions amongst autistic people and non-autistic people. They basically played a game of telephones, and they were given a set of instructions. There was an autistic group, there was a non-autistic group, and then they were mixed up at the end. Each person had to pass on instructions to the next. They had to do something and then pass on the next set of instructions. In the autistic group, everything flowed really, really well. And the thing that they had to build was built at the end. In the non-autistic group, things took a bit longer. There were more tea breaks and chats about the weather, but they ultimately passed on the information they needed to pass on, and the thing that they need to build was built at the end. So it showed that both groups communicated really clearly and openly amongst each other, and they both achieved the results they needed to. What they found when they mixed the groups together, that there was an automatic shift. The non-autistic people carried on communicating in the way that they communicated. The autistic people struggled with that communication, and instead of the non-autistic people recognizing that, they just barreled forward with their communication style because that's what's expected. The autistic people changed their communication styles. They masked to match the needs of the non-autistic people. And what resulted was, in the end, actually the thing that they're supposed to build, they couldn't because they ran out of time. So there was a disruption in communication. There was a gulf in the communication between the two groups, and the autistic people tried to change to meet the needs of the non-autistic people. On the right there, you can see a tweet that I posted, and it was actually really bizarre. So INSAR is a big research conference for autism researchers. It happens different places all over, every year in different places in the world, and all the autism researchers come together to present their research and have discussions and things like that. So there were two very strong narratives running at INSAR this year. So as you can see from the first tweet at the top there with the photo, it's a study that was a presentation of a study called The Neurodevelopment of Language in Infants at High Risk for Autism. On my Twitter feed, directly underneath that, was a tweet by Hannah Morton, which was talking about a presentation by Dr. Monique Botha from Stirling University that said eliminating stigma in autism research would create space to begin understanding autistic joy and flourishing. Two enormously different narratives, both existing in the same place. And then outside of that, in the research world outside of that conference, one study looking to drug autistic children and other studies looking to validate autistic experience. Which of those do you think is going to be more productive? So when we're looking at research like this, at these two vastly different narratives, how does an ethics committee decide what's ethical when they're part of the problem? When for years they have been part of the problem, when they don't recognize the inherent ableism and neuronormacy within research? It's a huge issue, and it's a huge crossroads of where we are with autism research. The impact of all of this, everything that I've mentioned so far, we haven't even talked about masking or burnout or anything yet, is catastrophic. So this is the huge, broad context as to why the mask exists, where the stigma comes from, where the mistreatment comes from. That's the groundwork for it. And we're going to get into specifics of what masking is in a minute. But before we get any further, we need to kind of define it. This is a huge statement. I will read it and I will break it down. So I'm not going to be quizzing anybody on this. And my screen's dropped off again, 2 ticks. So autistic masking is a developmental trauma response to external factors such as invalidation, stigma, and marginalization. It's a psychological safety mechanism made up of complex layers of physical, emotional, and social actions, which an autistic person is driven to use to self-protect and project a self-perceived acceptable version of who they are to other people. This occurs by attempting to apply in fluctuating degrees, often uncontextualized and sometimes rehearsed learnt behaviours to appropriate situations, while simultaneously suppressing both natural behaviours and self-identity, or conversely projecting an exaggerated baseline identity, for example, appearing more autistic. All this happens developmentally, partly consciously, with the person early on dissociating from the act, and from then on unconsciously, preemptive, reactive, and unplanned, and all at great mental and physical cost. Now, I've spent the last 10 years trying to rewrite this statement over and over and over and over again. And I'm currently writing a book with Dr. Amy Pearson, who I mentioned earlier, in which this definition is going to have to go in, and I'm still not happy with it. But every time, I've been tinkering with it for years, but every time I write it and rewrite it, it comes back to being focused around these key points. Masking is a trauma response. Masking is about projecting an acceptable version of who you are to other people. Masking is about suppressing natural behaviours. It happens on a conscious level and vastly more on an unconscious level, and it happens at great cost. We're going to get into the mechanics of masking in a sec. But first, we need to dispel some myths. So people out there will probably think that maybe they have an idea of what masking is. Even some autistic people might feel that they know what masking is, but unless actually you're part of the conversations that are going on now, we've realized that what we recognize as masking is very much just surface behaviors, and there's a lot more going on underneath. So first of all, masking is not just an autistic behavior. What's key to remember here is that masking in the streams that we're talking about is not just reserved for autistic people. So when we're talking about autistic masking, it's very specific to autistic people, but masking is actually a human behavior. We all mask to some extent, all human beings mask to some extent, because we do things called context switching and code switching. So this is where we change the way that we speak or our behavior when we're around different people. So kind of like different hats for different occasions. Some of us might have had grandmothers who had telephone voices, whose voices completely changed and became really posh when they answered the phone. We're different around our parents to how we are around our friends or around our colleagues, or so on and so forth. So that's human response. So that's the human level of masking. But when we're talking about masking in the way that we are here, we're talking about extremes that are trauma responses by marginalized groups. All marginalized groups have a way of masking, and different words to describe masking as well. Amongst people of colour, it's called passing. Amongst the queer community famously have the closet, and so on and so forth. So it's not just autistic people who mask to the extremes that we're talking about. But when we're talking about autistic masking, this is behaviours that are very specific to autistic people. Masking is not necessarily about appearing more neurotypical. Now, this is the way that masking has been framed, that it's about fitting in. What it is the trauma-fueled projection of an acceptable and expected version of yourself to those around you that keeps you safe. It's meeting other people's expectations of you. Now, for some autistic people, that might look like behaving less autistically and more neurotypically, or trying to appear more neurotypical. But for other autistic people, it might project in other ways. So it might be that if an autistic person is aware that others have a perception of that person, that they are going to engage in challenging behavior, that they are going to engage in behaviors that wouldn't be deemed as neurotypical, sometimes those behaviors can become exaggerated because you are meeting the expectations of others. So it's really important to recognize that masking is not just about hiding who you are and being more neurotypical. It can be actually projecting exaggerated behaviors of yourself. Masking is the fulfillment of confirmation bias. So this is what I mentioned before, presenting to those around you exactly what they expect to see. We all have confirmation bias about people in our lives. We all have confirmation bias. If you're an educationist and you've never met a child who's going to come into your class and you might have read a report on them, that report will give you confirmation bias. It's telling you about that person from someone else's perspective. So that's your expectation when they come in. So for an autistic child, that might be them actually knowing and being unconsciously aware that that's going to be your expectation. So they give you what you want to see. So it's the fulfillment of confirmation bias. Masking is as much about other people as it is about the individual who masks. It is about other people's bias and the lenses of ableism, sexism, racism, and narrow and flawed understanding of autism behavior that they look at you through. So when you see people who say, you know, a common narrative in schools, and I will be talking about education a lot, and I am not being critical of each individual teacher. I know I worked in schools for a very, very long time. I understand how difficult the job of teachers are, but we know that autistic children struggle in schools, and much of that isn't because they're autistic. Much of it is because of the lack of information and support that teachers are given, and the very rigid education system that we currently exist in. So masking is as much about other people. 50% of it is about the behavior of the autistic person, but the other 50% is about the people around that autistic person. When we say children are fine in school, we don't recognize them as autistic. As professionals, what that really means is we don't have enough information to be able to make that judgment. That's the reality of the situation, because so many autistic children go through school unrecognized or don't get recognized until they're teens or later on as adults, because other people aren't informed enough to recognize them as autistic people. We fall into our biases around their behaviors and things like that, using the terms that I used earlier, things like geeky and nerdy and bookish and all of those kind of things, or we use other diagnoses to mask those behaviors, to recognize those behaviors as well. Behavioral kind of more OCD, oppositional defiance disorder, things like that. We use our lens of biases to describe one thing. We pick up things that we recognize and then we push people into those boxes because we only recognize a part. Humans are very good at compartmentalizing but not seeing the big picture. Masking is a process that all autistic people go through regardless of their current conditions. So firstly, there is a narrative that not all autistic people mask. Well, that would be saying that not all autistic people are human, because we all mask. We've established that. So, but masking to the level that we're talking about is a process that all autistic people go through. The problem is that the narrative up till now has been about hiding being autistic, when actually that narrative is now broadening out to recognize that there's exaggeration going on as well. There's also a narrative that says that autistic people with co-occurring learning disabilities can't mask, which again is a complete, that's saying they're not human beings as well. All human beings go through this, and even people with learning disabilities or physical disabilities mask and change their behaviors in ways to meet other people's needs. This is a human thing. And part of that is because masking can be encouraged through conditioning, compliance, and pushes to conformity. So we have narratives. I'm going to click up the next one because that's relevant to this one. Because masking is often encouraged in the social world, in society, and specifically through therapeutic processes as well, through professional gaslighting, because the social world and therapies are built and centered on the experiences and responses of non-autistic people. And diagnosed autistic people, or young people and children, are more likely to be put through things like social skills training or behavioral therapies because of these ideas, and those things encourage masking. So what does it look like? It looks like this. So over the years that I've been embedded in the autistic community, that I've been doing research, the I've just been around autistic people. I've picked up kind of flags and indicators of what's going on, the mechanics of masking. I want you to imagine it as a kind of an engine with multiple moving parts, flowing and shifting and changing with context as well. Most of what you can see in front of you are born out of threat responses, invalidation, or some negative experience. As you can already see from a glance, this is far beyond simply adapting to different environments or experiences, and it's far from just connected to social experiences as well, because there is a narrative that autistic people enter a social situation, pick up their mask, put it on, navigate the social situation, then take it off again at the end. And that's not what's happening here, because there is so much unconscious behavior. And this is a developmental behavior as well, and as a response to developmental trauma and developmental invalidation. So this is something that's happening all the time for autistic people. So we have the behavioral and emotional aspects, things like personality shifting. I'm not going to read all of them because we'll be here all day, but I can make the slide available to everyone. I can send it through to Carrie, and you can pick this apart as you want to, and obviously you have a recording of this as well. So things like personality shifting, exaggerating your personality or acting up, fawning and people pleasing plays a huge part in this. And that's things like saying what people want you to say or taking on more than you can cope with, saying yes to things, falling into expected gender roles, as I mentioned earlier. So the way that we are socialized around gender, and falling into those roles can actually hide the fact that we're autistic from the outside world, because they're expecting you to behave in certain ways. And then when you give it, well, then you're not autistic. And also things like taking the blame when things aren't your fault as well. There's the linguistic aspects of it, so things like scripting, mirroring other people's behaviors, using echolalia, which is a repetition of sounds and either internally or externally, using that to say specific things in specific times. So it might be someone uses a line from a book or from a movie or a TV show in context in the right place, because they've seen that happen on TV. And then if you use that line, then that helps you navigate through the next bit. Using directed hyperlexia. So hyperlexia is the ability to read and understand context of written language and spoken language much earlier than you would expect. So children that can read before the age of 5, children that can use big words in context and have kind of adult conversations with young children. This is hyperlexia, but you can hide behind that as well, because you can make yourself sound more intelligent than you actually are. So that's why I've got hiding behind intelligent fluff. Playing for time, changing your accent, really common for autistic children, and also just keeping quiet, not speaking. You can change your appearance, your physical and your behavioral appearance as well. So that might be your clothes, your makeup, changing the way that you move, doing things in a way that's unnatural for you but expected of you by other people. So things like body language, we have all these expert body language interpreters. Whenever you see photos of celebrities, you always they bring in an expert body language to read what's happening in the situation in the photo. And it's rubbish, really, because for neurodivergent people and autistic people particularly, our body language can be very different. I fold my arms all the time, even when I'm talking to someone. A body language expert would tell you that that's confrontational and I'm not engaged in the conversation and putting a physical barrier up to the conversation. No, I'm folding my arms because it's comfortable. That's it. So it doesn't mean I'm less engaged with what's going on with you. Things like eye contact as well. So that's always been a big thing around autistic people. I do not know why. You do not need to use your eyes in order to listen. Sometimes you need to look away in order to hear better. So that's really important for autistic children. But over the years, it's all been about, you must make eye contact. So part of masking is actually looking at faces, but not looking directly at the eyes, a fixed point on someone's face. So that's just one example. Suppression of physical and mental and emotional kind of feelings. So this is not moving naturally, as we've said before, with your behavior. This is suppressing your emotions and your emotional responses, and suppressing your sensory responses as well. This is redirecting things like your stims, the way that autistic people need to move in order to process and express themselves, redirecting those into more socially acceptable ways of being, putting your hands in your pockets and fiddling with things in your pockets, stuff like that, instead of big gestures or rocking or however you might stim. Suppressing your physical and emotional exhaustion to all of this. Doing all this is exhausting, physically and emotionally, but you have to suppress that as well, because nobody understands. Unless you've got this context, you can't verbalize what's going on for you. And quite often, because of something we're going to get to in a minute, you don't even know half of this is going on to you as an autistic person. And on top of this is a suppression of your identity and your thoughts and your wishes. And that's a really important factor here. And what that stems from is that word that's right smack bang in the middle there, which is dissociation. This is the developmental compartmentalization of all this behavior until it becomes mostly unconscious and you're unaware that it's happening. The outcomes of this is that autistic people, and this is evidenced in research, are more easily manipulated and coerced, are more open to conditioning, are more likely to be subject to physical and sexual abuse, are more likely to be victims of interpersonal violence, are more likely to experience autistic burnout, which we're going to get to, are more likely to have poor mental health, more likely to enter vulnerable situations, more likely to be blamed. You can see it goes on and on and on and on. These things aren't occurring because a person is autistic, as was previously thought. But because autistic people have been developmentally conditioned into this by society and relationships as well, in which invalidation, stigmatization and pathologization on a huge number of levels is constantly happening to autistic people, literally from birth, whether we know people are autistic or not. When this is happening to you, you're developing authentic self as a child very, very early on starts to shut down, and a stronger inauthentic persona eventually breaks off and eventually takes over. You live your life superficially confused, disjointed, permanently unsettled, only knowing that you have to give people what they expect from you, however that looks, and it's all at the whim of those around you to steer you. I haven't done my homework. I got distracted last night. I was supposed to read a chapter of a book and write a book report, but I read the whole book and then I had to go to bed. I knew I needed to write the report. I tried to tell Mum, but the words were locked in my head. All I could do was comply and quietly nod and agree with Mum when she asked me to clean my teeth and get into bed. So I did. I lay there, eyes wide open for hours, wanting to wait until Mum had gone to bed so I could get back up and write it. It got later and longer and longer and later, and I must have fallen asleep. My alarm goes off and I wake up, and already inwardly I'm panicking, screaming and shouting inside my skull. I try to follow my routine quicker so I'll have time to write it, but I start forgetting things and have to keep going back. I forgot my sock 3 times and ended up stuck in a causal loop, staring into space, just swaying gently. Mum shouts at me again and again, and inside, like pushing myself out of thick mud, I feel myself rise to the surface enough to shout, "Coming!" Comes out wrong though. It sounds rude and angry. I didn't mean it to sound that way. Mum's cross. She's shouting at me. Dad's lunging up the stairs, ready to smack me, and I'm sat on the bed in my trousers, rocking harder and harder, one sock half hanging off my foot. No shirt. I haven't done my homework. My brain seizes up and I explode, screaming and crying, just an eruption of noise, an outpouring of pain and frustration. And it goes on and on and on. My dad dresses me roughly as I'm still screaming and carries me out to his van. I quieten during the 10-minute drive to school. We pull up outside. We're late. I haven't done my homework. Inside, a version of me is screaming to be let out. Outside, the mask has come down. I turn to my father and I ask, "Do I look like I've been crying?" So, where are we at? 11:30. Quick break, and then we'll come back and I will give you some more context on masking, and we'll start to look at burnout and its relationship with school. So I'm going to give you 3 minutes. because I talk for far too long. So go and make yourself a quick cup of tea, have a wee, and we'll be back at, what's the time on the clock? Ooh, can't see. We'll come back at 11:35. It's 30 more seconds and we'll get back in. All right then. I hope everyone's back. If you're not, unlucky. This has been recorded, so if you miss a minute or two, obviously you can come back and watch any bits that you miss. Masking has its origins in the earliest of socialization and is rooted in both sensory and communication differences. As one example, if you consider an undiagnosed autistic baby, what if that baby finds touch uncomfortable? Or worse, has a sensory response of pain upon touch? Babies are put through a constant cycle of touch. They're picked up, put down, wiped, prodded, cuddled, poked. And what's the only way that they can communicate that this is hurting them? Well, they cry. So then what happens? They're picked up, put down, wiped, prodded, cuddled, poked. If you continue that cycle, eventually the autistic baby figures out that no matter what it does, the touching's not going to stop. It doesn't become desensitized. It stops reacting in the unconscious hope that the touching will become minimalized. It suppresses. It protects itself. it complies. This is just one example. It's already learning how to mask. Later, the child is taken to places with other babies and toddlers, groups and nursery and preschool. Amidst the sensory overstimulation of the new environment, the child starts to figure out it's not like the other children, that acting in certain ways causes the child to be punished or singled out by the other children, or that other children act in certain ways that get rewarded. The child finds that complaints about the sensory environment lead to dismissal, if they can even be communicated at all. So they could start to mirror the others. There's no context to what they're copying. They just know everyone else is acting in a certain way and gets favoured for it. Eye contact brings praise, no matter how much it hurts. Sitting perfectly still brings praise, no matter how much you need to move in order to concentrate. Whole body listening, the direct opposite to the way you need to listen, becomes something you are told again and again you have to do. You are told the way you speak is rude. You're told to behave, completely contextless direction. You are given a million different instructions when you're standing in the eye of a tornado of noise and sensory information and emotion that only you can see and hear and feel, but nobody else is reacting to. So you hold it all in. It starts to become safer to give people what they expect from you. Silence, behavior, comedy, weirdness. Giving them what they expect from you makes them feel better, so you can predict how you are going to be treated. There's reassurance in that predictability, even when you know it's going to be negative. This carries on. The child arrives at school where social situations become more complex, where the sensory environment is more overstimulating, more painful. The expectation to sit and engage and comply increases, and so does the masking. Adults question the child's behaviours when they're deemed negative or inappropriate, and very quickly the child learns not to display them, or to display them exaggeratedly, or release them in some other way. The child is dismissed when they complain things are too loud or that their clothes hurt them, so they stop complaining. They struggle to understand the communication that's going on around them. Nobody learns their way of communicating. The tornado just keeps growing and growing and growing. The expectations and demands placed on the child rise. They're pushed and they either fail or mask harder. And if they mask harder, what does the teacher see? The quiet boy or girl, the bookish one who avoids attention, or conversely the one eager to please, eager to answer, or even more conversely the one acting up, or the class clown, the nerdy one, the weird one, in all ways providing the teacher with exactly what they expect to see from them. Later still, the child develops into adulthood and has to repeatedly navigate this social world with the responsibility of accessing and staying in the workforce, maintaining their physical and mental health, maintaining an income, paying bills, maintaining a home, family, relationships, parenthood, all with this expectation of being an adult who is able to cope and do those things. And then, when stage managing this consciously and unconsciously becomes too much, masking is effectively holding your breath. The regulation you need to occur does not occur, and eventually you have to breathe or pass out. Autistic people live under a constant narrative so subtle, non-autistic people probably don't even realise they're part of, as educators, as therapists, even parents, as part of society. Broken and fix. We have to hold our breath because of this invalidating narrative. It lives in bringing confirmation bias to the fore, either in applying social norms that are effectively unachievable for autistic people, by demanding communication which is incomprehensible and denying communication methods that work, and by bringing personal bias around sensory information into play. It exists developmentally in phrases like sit still, quiet hands, look at me, eyes to the front, it's not that bad, you'll get over it, stop making such a fuss. Well, they were smiling, so they must like it. It was okay for me, so it must be okay for them. You don't need that. Stop making that noise. With none of those statements taking into account the needs and feelings of the individual that's the target of them. In fact, they summarily dismiss their needs or pointedly gaslight the person. I have another example. When we say someone doesn't like a certain sensory experience, now that actually looks like a positive advocation of individual need, but the phrase doesn't like, I've heard it used so many times by parents, carers and professionals to describe an autistic young person in a sensory response of actual pain. It encourages the dismissal of the individual's needs by downgrading its importance. The invalidation of sensory differences sits alongside how autistic people's communication styles are invalidated, how our behaviour is pathologized and constantly termed as negative, and how much of what is done to us, either through specific behavioural therapies or behavioural ideology, social skills training, or just society, just invalidating and dismissing us, is focused on the normalisation of the autistic person based on what I and others term neuronormative standards. It's this assumption that there is a right way of doing things because society deems that there is a right way of doing things, based not on any evidence, but simply because, well, that's what people do. The issue with this way of thinking is not only flawed, quite frankly, it's enormously egotistical. Many of our social conventions and social norms are geographical and change dependent on where you are in the world, sometimes from house to house. And most of those have evolved beyond their original meaning to the point where most people can't even tell you why they do certain things. Yet we think we can train and should train social skills, giving autistic children rules that are not rules because they're fluid, giving autistic children instructions in how to think and feel and act that go against the innate nature of who they are. Autistic children in the current education system are often punished in some way when they display autistic behaviour, and conversely are often rewarded when they display non-autistic behaviour. If your neurology is not built in a way that allows you to do what other people do, but in actual fact wants you to do things in a very different way, but you're constantly told that what you're doing is wrong, or you're told that your reaction is over the top or unnecessary, that you'll be all right, or don't be so silly, how would that make you feel? Around us constantly is the invalidation of neurodivergent experience. Autistic neurology has an interest-driven and problem-solving focus. It actually has a name now, something else that's come out of research, monotropism. It's all about attention, and I'd urge you to look up that term. I've got a cartoon I can share with Carrie, if you remind me, Carrie. If nobody can give an autistic person a good reason as to why they are feeling different from everyone else, or why they have problems in their life, and why everyone around them dismisses their feelings or ignores their pain, the only solution to this problem that they can come up with is that they are the problem, that they are broken in some way. And to further back this up, when you turn to the literature, when you look at autism through most mediums, it's solely focused on how autistic people are broken, how we fail to communicate properly, how we don't fit in, how we show challenging behavior, how our thoughts and movements and reactions upset other people, and so on. All of that actually just describes how autistic people aren't non-autistic people, but it's been twisted to say that autistic people are broken versions of non-autistic people with deficits and autistic traits. It invalidates and dehumanizes a perfectly natural autistic human being and instead tells us that what we're dealing with is a human being with bits that don't work properly. What this does is hand the autistic person, child and adult, an internal narrative of internalized ableism, a voice which says, you can't do this. You shouldn't be like this. This is your fault. The internal voice that we inherit from the world around us is, I'm not good enough. I need to change. I need to improve. I need to get better. I need to stop melting down. I need to stop making mistakes. I need to sit still. I need to listen. I need to work harder at being like everyone else. Why don't I have friends? Why don't people like me? Why do I get picked on? Why am I the only one in pain? Why am I different? I need to understand better. This is all my fault. I need to be less me and more everyone else. I need to be normal. But nobody understands us. Not really. So the response to that from society is to blame us for all those things. or at least blame autism, which society thinks is a wholly separate part of us that can and should be overcome. Broken and fix. We're expected to meet everyone else's demands and needs, many of which don't even make sense. We're expected to communicate in ways that are unnatural for us. We're put through social skills training so we can learn to mask and fit in better with everyone else. We are expected to change, to be the better versions of ourselves that other people expect us to be like non-autistic people. We're expected to conform to this singular way of being, to be the gold standard version of a human that the neurotypical world subscribes us to. That even if it doesn't implicitly say it, it reinforces with therapies and social rules and punishments for being our natural selves. So we feel wrong. We turn on ourselves and eat ourselves up. We're not like other people, but we should be like other people, and everyone in our lives reinforces that. Subliminally, we're made to feel that we are burdens to our families because of the constant battle for support. Autism gets the blame for it, so therefore we take on the blame for it. Invalidation. We're made to feel that we're burdens on society by people that talk only about our deficits and usually do that right in front of us. Lost my talk again. Oh, there it is. On the news, in the media, in research, in books, in schools, in the workplace, on social media, to our faces. How many times has a parent gone for an appointment where they're asked to talk about the challenging behaviour, the traits, the embarrassing things their child has said or done, and the child is right there in the room? School. Often the biggest single trigger in the life of an autistic child, a potential stimulatory hellhole for many, where constant overwhelm can be the only feeling available, yet parents are constantly told that they're fine. Work, often the biggest single trigger in the life of an autistic adult, where in both settings, reasonable adjustments have to be written in law after an extended and lengthy process, agreed upon by a wodge of different people, and are only usually superficially enacted upon. Despite the fact that the autistic person, child and adult, is making hundreds and thousands of reasonable adjustments just to exist in the building. Yet as children, they're expected to get on, to act like the other kids, to wear the uniform that scratches, to put up with the jostling, the constant barrage of noise, the expectation, the inability to keep up. And when they can't keep up, well, they show challenging behaviour. And when they can't take it anymore, their school refuses. The child constantly framed as the problem. As adults, they're expected to communicate the same way as other people, get second guessed by asking questions, often told they're rude or overbearing. How many times do we see and hear autistic people being discussed publicly in the most disgusting ways? See autistic children subjected to drug studies to make them more sociable, bombarded with sensory input to make them more resilient, coerced and manipulated by behavioural therapies and social skills ideologies, and all this happens in the open, showcased in the media, on social media, discussed by parents and professionals in full view of autistic people. Constant narratives around us that we're emotionless, soulless, rigid, that we're incompetent, that we're robots or aliens, that we're serial killers or mass murderers, that all we do is melt down and hurt people or ourselves. And then when we're older, if we make it that far, and if we're lucky and not institutionalized, we're offered counseling and therapy that's completely unaware of all this trauma and supports us to rework our disordered and broken thinking because it's us that's the problem. This is the crux of why the mask exists, because our brains take all this trauma from direct and indirect invalidation and creates a defense mechanism, which developmentally just gets stronger and stronger. A defense mechanism which has an enormous impact on the development of our identities, our mental health, and physical well-being. A defense mechanism that projects as close to a semblance of comfort to the observer as possible, because normal behavior in front of others equals safety. What's the issue with all this? Well, the biggest thing is there is no normal. It doesn't exist. We're constantly told that there is no such thing as normal. but the world assigns arbitrary targets and objectives and standards based upon the principle that there is a normal. The professional world does that all the time. It's a paradox. How can you be something that doesn't exist? The autistic response to that is the mask. The longer it does its job, the better it gets at doing it. The strategies develop and repeat into the adult world and onward. The more complex the situations and relationships, the harder the mask works. The harder it works, the more suppressed the individual underneath becomes, and the stronger they dissociate from it. And the better it gets, the more resources it steals. Layer upon layer of trauma. Layer upon layer of mask responding to trauma. The amount of monotropic singular focus it takes to achieve the mask is immense. The amount of energy that goes into maintaining it is incredible. And the more complex the mask becomes, the more resources it needs to remain sustainable. What's missing from the whole narrative of masking, what non-autistic professionals are never privy to, is the pervasiveness of it. The fact that we dissociate from the act, that this mask effectively buries our true selves deep down, far from the eyes of our parents, friends, relatives, partners, children, our therapists, and often even ourselves. Each micro trauma right from day one quickly creates an amorphous, glutinous layer that gets overlaid over the person. Layer after layer after layer until we are literally soaked in shame and invalidation. It hardens and it becomes the mask, an impenetrable shell of trauma, which underneath is caustic and dissolves the forming identity inside to the point that those who become aware of the mask's existence often fear that underneath there is nobody, that they're a void. This is not people choosing to hide, who pick strategies to support themselves through a series of confusing situations. This is a constantly developing, life-enveloping trauma response created by the need to present a front, project an acceptable persona in order to keep oneself safe. The more worn down a person is, then the more likely it is that the mask slips or cracks a little temporarily, which happens to many autistic people. An example for this would be for those of you that do have school-aged children or work with school-aged children who experience post-school meltdowns and significant expressions of distress behaviour outside of school, when all school see is an angel every day that behaves beautifully or at least acts in the way that they're expected to act. A common phrase heard by parents is that their autistic child is fine in school. For the most part, they aren't fine. They're surviving. They're doing what they need to do to keep themselves safe in an unsafe environment. They're masking. Teachers usually just don't have the context or the knowledge to see that. The same sometimes happens with autistic adults post-work too. This post-traumatic environment behaviour actually has a name. It's called the Coca-Cola effect, because it's comparable to opening a bottle of Coke after shaking it vigorously for a length of time. At home, the masking person either feels safe enough or exhausted to the point where they cannot sustain the mask, so a day's worth of suppression and pent-up emotion comes flooding out. For some autistics, either through not feeling safe or through the depths of their mask, unleashing all of this is not possible, so it gets pushed down deep inside. Often those people are the ones that melt down infrequently. The autistic community tend to refer to people like this, people such as myself, as internalizers. We tend to shut down rather than melt down. For teachers, this post-school behaviour should be a red flag that something's very wrong at school. Instead, it's too often seen as the parent's problem or as a result of bad parenting. For adults, if this is an apt description of you, or if the following is an apt description, then it's possible that masking is playing a part in your life too. The price paid for a day spent masking is exhaustion. This is sometimes described as social burnout or autism fatigue. You may hear it described as autistic people shutting down after being around people or in unsafe environments, burying themselves under blankets, sleeping, or for some staring mindlessly at tablets or phones for hours. Someone unable to function, in inverted commas, as they would normally do, withdrawing and isolating. The issue is that this is a way to try and recharge, but it isn't a good way to recharge. If you think of it in terms of a mobile phone battery, if you only recharge it in short bursts or try to charge without ever switching the phone off, you damage the battery. It never fully charges, and each time you do so, the charge holds for less time. If the masking autistic is not given a sustained and lengthy opportunity to withdraw and not mask, or their needs are continuously not met, then it's likely that they will end up in extreme burnout, which looks like this. I'm not going to go through this. I will give you the slide because, again, we're running short of time. But as you can see, extreme burnout presents in a vast variety of ways. Sometimes all the signs are present, or they're present in different extremes. They include a whole myriad of things, which, again, I don't have time to go through now, but we can explore this in the Q&A. But you'll notice similarities with what is called autistic regression. There's a school of thought that actually what is termed regression, what's described as a loss of skills, is actually autistic burnout. So in the times where autistic children become more obviously autistic to the people around them, around the age of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, that actually this is a period of autistic burnout where they're unable to mask as well. What most people feel is confusion and frustration. Because of the lack of research into this, unless they've engaged with the autistic community, they won't even know what's happening to them. This is a phenomenon that has repeatedly been described amongst autistic adults and children for decades, for about the last 40 years. Yet because of that lack of research, there are only 5 research papers into this, and 3 of them came out this year, and a complete lack of understanding of autism, masking and burnout. It's often misdiagnosed as depression. Burnout can lead to depression, certainly, but it's rarely identified separately by professionals. I'm sure many of you can recognise these symptoms from autistic people you know or have worked with. Sorry, my slide's going again. Or even from yourself. In fact, any of you that has a child that's been deemed as a school refusal does not exist. I would seriously recommend exploring the potential that may be autistic. The reason that I say school refusal does not exist is because all that does is place the blame on the child. Language matters here, and we need to place the onus on the real reason. The reason they are unable to attend school is because of school-induced anxiety, or to go even further, school-induced trauma. This is a response to an environment. These narratives are common in autistic young people and adults who disappear to their rooms and can't bring themselves to come out, or adults who have increasing levels of OCD, agoraphobia, and social anxiety, and so on. People who become withdrawn and appear to be depressed, which then does lead to depression often because there aren't any other narratives to inform the professionals or families around them. How do you support children like this, or adults like this even? These are burnt out children. They're unable to project this acceptable version of themselves anymore. They've lost that skill. So schools and professionals and also families need to be supported to start to recognise the damage that school environments do to autistic children. And the impact of things like flooding. Flooding is where you take a child who's not going to school and you immerse them in that environment. You drag them there every day, and with the hope that they will get used to it, that they'll learn to become more resilient. That's the narrative that we currently have with children who engage with what is currently termed school refusal. You think of the hypocrisy of this. As an adult, if I can't attend a workplace because of my mental health or because of my physical health, I can go to my GP and get signed off. Teachers, social workers. This happens a lot for teachers and social workers. They become mentally or ill or poor ill health through the stresses of their work. They go and get signed off, but children are dragged to school. It is complete hypocrisy, and it shows that we have greater expectations of our children than we do of ourselves. We put more on our kids than we put on ourselves. These are children that need time to withdraw. They need time in sensory-rich environments that are good for them. They need space to be able to recharge their batteries. They need low-demand environments where the demands on them are taken away. That's what children in these environments need. And that's a very small example, but I'm sure we'll address this more in the Q&A. Some quick stats just for you to read while I'm talking. Everyone loves syrup on their pancakes, at least I do. Can you imagine though if that syrup was poured over you so that your movements become slower, poured into your ears so your hearing becomes more difficult, into your mouth and eyes so your speech and sight become affected, into your nose so that breathing becomes conscious and more difficult to maintain, into your brain so that your thoughts are dulled and slow, where everything you do is affected, and you have to work twice or three times harder, when you lose your momentum or can't even get the inertia to start things. Everything hurts and aches. Your batteries are depleted. Everything's louder, brighter, sharper, rougher. Food's tasteless or overwhelming. Smells are stronger. You have tunnel vision. Your mind drowns in forgetfulness. And then try living like that. And try going to school. Try doing what your teacher wants you to do. Try doing anything other than the minimal you need to exist. And the longer it goes on, try keeping mentally well. Diagnosed and undiagnosed autistic children and adults are doing this every day, most of them going through patterns of longer and longer burnout. Part of this is a response to living in the non-autistic world, the way that non-autistic people want us to, doing the things that we are told that we have to do, projecting that version of ourselves that's deemed acceptable and appropriate. And part of this is the energy consumption of the mask over the course of our lifespans, maintaining the us that's expected of us. So where does that take us? The average life expectancy in the UK pre-COVID is 80. Traditional themes in the lives of autistic people, young and old, are poor mental health, poor physical health, and depression. The average range of death for autistic people is 36 to 54. I want those numbers burned into your minds because they're burned into mine. I'm 43 in October. But slap bang in the middle of those numbers, and I'm ever apparent that this is a red zone in my life, ever hopeful that I'm the statistical anomaly. I've shared with you awful statistics about suicide rates, self-harm, homelessness, unemployment, mental health conditions. Time after time, academics, professionals and society wander around scratching their heads. Remember that tweet? Why all these negatives exist in the lives of autistic people, while at the same time putting us through all the awful things that I've just described, stigmatizing us so that we don't develop identities for ourselves. The world tries its best to make sure that we cannot live our lives as our authentic selves because that's just not socially acceptable. And then we're blamed for it all because we're not fully formed human beings. Our biggest killers are heart attack and suicide, aside from epilepsy. All of this points to autistic people both in distress and suffering from stress. But the assumption being made by researchers is that autism is the root cause of all of this. We live in a world where we're made to feel like we're worthless, where we're expected to overcome our neurology because a bunch of people decided they don't like it, where we are constantly dehumanized, where every single thing that we do is scrutinized and pathologized, where billions of dollars are spent researching cures and causes and little's actually spent on proactive, useful support. A world in which the diagnostic criteria that measures our worth and our value and our existence states that everything autistic people do, how we think, how we feel, how we move, how we communicate, is disordered, is as the result of a condition, is broken. A world where we are told that literally everything we do is wrong, and a world that leads to autistic people saying things like this. I think this is it, Mum. 19 years is my limit. That's a direct quote. Is autism really the root cause of all this? Is autism to blame? I don't think so. We live in societies that need to take a long, hard look at themselves, at what they think, how they act. So they stop projecting onto those they fear for being different. And they stop applying standards of existence to certain aspects of society based on an impossible notion of what it means to be fully human, using nothing more than textbook knowledge, flawed research, and professional hubris. Research like Sarah Cassidy's study on suicidality amongst autistic people identified autistic masking as a major lead-in to the high suicide rate of autistic people. Yet the current masking narrative calls it a choice, a social strategy, sees this thing which kills us as a positive decision that helps us, makes us socially acceptable. We are not choosing to die. We're not choosing to be oppressed, invalidated and traumatized into exhaustion to the point where the only avenue for escape is to take our own lives or be stressed into death. This is a choice being made by the world around us, for us. A world where the non-autistic part needs to step back from applying its needs to our situations. Very quickly, because I know I've run over, I have a framework that I use when I consult with organizations and work with therapists, teachers, and so on and so forth. And I call it Advocate because it has 8 pillars to it. I'll show you the slide that has the 8 pillars on, and again, I'll make this available to Carrie. But it's all focused around 4 words: acceptance, agency, autonomy, and authenticity. That's it. If you are working with an autistic person or autistic child, if you are a parent of an autistic child, if you're an ally of an autistic person, this is what your aim is for that person. The acceptance, you accept them, they understand and accept themselves, which then gives them agency over their choices, which then gives the autonomy to act out those choices, and which then enables them to be authentic. That's how you crack poor mental health amongst autistic people. Self-understanding, ownership over choices, the ability to act out on those choices, and then the ability to be authentic. That's it. It's so simple. The 8 pillars, a little bit more complicated. And again, I won't take you all through them, but the 8 pillars are there on the left-hand side. And again, I'll make the slide available. The concept of neurodiversity, the study from Edinburgh, Diversity and Social Intelligence, which backs up that autistic people actually communicate really effectively. Recognizing those diversity in communication, movement, thoughts, and sensory and trauma experiences. The double empathy problem, which I'll make a cartoon available on that as well. Monotropism, which I touched on before. Understanding the historical narrative behind all of this, why things are as bad as they are, and then using that to think critically and go out and seek positive and productive sources of knowledge. Looking into the environment, which isn't just the geographical environment, it's the people within the environment as well, the communication, the emotion, the sensory environment, every level of the environments that we exist in, and recognizing that autistic identity is fundamental to all of this. Fitting in is not the answer. Learning to exist in the real world is not the answer. If your neurology dictates that that's not how you can live, then it should be understood, acknowledged, accepted, and others supported to recognize and celebrate the fact that it's okay that you have different needs to them. The word marginalization exists for a reason, because the society we exist in is not inclusive. There is no real world that we need to prepare for. It's a non-inclusive society that favors people who act in a certain way. Rather than adapting to the needs of its members, it requires its members to conform to a narrow interpretation of existence or be exiled from it. Ultimately, all of this is about validation and the recognition that there's not one way of doing things, or even close to a right way of doing things. It's recognizing that your confirmation bias and preconceived notions play not only a huge part in the invalidation of autistic people, but are specifically grounded in the failure to recognize the needs of autistic people from an autistic perspective. Because then, instead of furiously trying to measure us up against neuronormative standards that we cannot meet, or that we try to meet through masking, which actively harms us, you can start focusing on a strengths model that recognizes both the positive and negative aspects of all of the things going on in our lives and looks at how we need to work with that to help us thrive in whatever way that looks for us as individuals. We need the control and autonomy that is denied us. We need that moment of equity and justice to be achieved and sustained. Our autistic selves need to be enabled to be looked at with value by others and also by ourselves. And maybe one day we can stop having so much trauma inflicted on us that our brains don't feel the need to subconsciously decide it has to knock out the driver, engage in stealth mode, and take part in actions that are shown to have a direct link to the ridiculously high suicide rate and early death of autistic people. Where autistic physical and emotional development, autistic culture, autistic life, an autistic way of being can be validated and celebrated rather than persecuted and ignored and pathologized. You'll be happy to know we're at the end. So I'm ending this by bringing us back to that slide and that statement. Autistic people are 4 times as likely to experience depression over the course of their lives as their neurotypical peers. Yet researchers know little about why or how they can help. I hope you now have some context with which to see the ridiculousness of this statement, and may wonder why we mask. Thank you all.